All right. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Baumer. I do want to start by letting folks know if you are an AICP, don't forget to register this event as a certification maintenance credit. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. Bonnie Johnson, Fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners, Professor of Urban Planning, and Assistant Director of the School of Public Affairs and Administration at the University of Kansas. Dr. Johnson has spent many years as a practicing planner and then went back and jumped into academia. Her research and teaching draws from her experiences as an award-winning practitioner and academic. She looks to create innovative engagement opportunities and empower planners as civic leaders. She believes, as many of us do, that planners can save the world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bonnie Johnson.
Okay, can you hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you very much, Maria. I appreciate that nice introduction. So thank you so much for having me here for the Baumer Lecture series. I hope all of you are prepared. Hold on tight. I'm going to talk about planning, planners, urban planning, the planning profession. So let's just take a moment and shake it out. Let's get loose. Okay. Oh, all right. Okay. All right. Because we are on the hunt for that special something that will free our minds and make planning magic. So in teaching, they teach you that we are supposed to start off our classes, our lectures, with an advanced organizer so that students can get their minds in the right place and know where you're headed. So, okay, advanced organizer. So for me, I have to say I often lean on Jane Jacobs. She was a big thinker and observer of city life. She really took planners to task. And I think it is so cool that planners have embraced their sharpest critic. It shows great maturity and self-actualization, or a good deal of self-loathing to do such a thing and embrace your critic. But I think it's noble to be able to look in the mirror, take constructive criticism, and try to be better. Jacobs was an advocate of web thinking or systems thinking. So how the sidewalks, how the ballet of the sidewalk is connected to eyes on the street, that is then connected to healthy neighborhoods. But I sometimes feel like that we can sometimes get caught up in the web and nobody knows what we're talking about. So maybe a different advanced organizer as we're looking for magic. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but sometimes I will see something or hear something, and I swear physically my brain does a backflip. I'll go, and then I will see things differently. So I'm looking for that special something in planning that makes planners, citizens, anyone that cares about their communities will go, kind of like the skateboarder's skateboard flipping. Or like Philadelphia planner extraordinaire Edmund Bacon illegally skateboarding in Love Park. So something like Bette Midler, the divine Miss M, the rose, the wind beneath your wings, the ruthless people, Hocus Pocus, and Hello Dolly. She thinks planners are great. Who knew? At the 2000 National Planning Conference, she was a speaker. she was receiving an award. And she said, I didn't know what planning was, but she had started a foundation in New York that would go around and revitalize green spaces in low-income neighborhoods. And so she was getting an award for that. But she said, if I hadn't become an entertainer, I think I would have liked to have been a planner. Go figure. Bette Midler as a planner. And in her speech, she said, you all are so great. You need to speak up more. You need to shout from the rooftops. And it was interesting, the response in the room. So this was the big awards luncheon at the National Planning Conference. Hundreds of planners there. Half the room, when she said that, leapt up and applauded. The other half kind of sat there, a little uncomfortable. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. And then out in the hallway after the speech, the conversations were, well, I'm not sure we're supposed to be doing that. I think, that's for the elected officials. We're to be neutral. But that got me to thinking, well, what is our role? And could we be the divine Miss M of planning? Is that possible? So how about In Vogue's swaggering 1992 plea for social justice? Free your mind and the rest will follow. I actually went researching this lyric, free your mind, and I found it has been addressed in scholarly articles. And the scholarly articles say something like, it's not enough. This sort of sentiment is naive, and metaphor is not transformation. So I thought, well, how can we ensure action? And I went searching for, what could really shake up the planning paradigm? And I found what inspired In Vogue. And what inspired In Vogue was the 1970s release by the George Clinton band Funkadelic. And their advice was free your mind and your ass will follow. And I thought, aha, that's something we need in planning. So I went searching for what is it that's going to free our mind? And yes, I'm going to go from Funkadelic to Anne Roe Lindbergh. Hopefully that will make your brain go, So at times, I read this poem at graduation as we send Jayhawk planners out into the world. So the poem is Alms by Anne Roe Lindbergh, and here it goes. Like birds in winter, you fed me, knowing the ground was frozen, knowing I should never come to your hand, knowing you did not need my gratitude, softly, like snow falling on snow, softly, so not to frighten me, softly, you threw your crumbs upon the ground and walked away. As a professor, I sometimes feel like this is the best I can do. Throw some crumbs upon the ground and walk away. So I'm going to leave some crumbs today and hopefully free your mind and ass along the way. So crumbs, starting with Anne Roe Lindbergh. Anne Roe Lindbergh was the first woman licensed as a glider pilot in the U.S. She later became a licensed pilot, navigator, radio operator, diplomat, aerial photographer, circumnavigator of the globe, charting flight paths for future commercial airlines. She was a pioneer in aviation history. She was an environmentalist, a mom, a poet, and a writer. In 1930, she and her husband Charles broke the transcontinental speed record flying from LA to New York. She did it while 7 months pregnant. Charles, her co-pilot was not pregnant. And you know the clear covering that you see on old airplanes that can be moved back and forth so the pilots can get in? She invented it. So a little bit more about Anne Merle Lindbergh. So she never gave interviews. I found an article by Amelia Earhart where Amelia Earhart had met Anne. And Amelia Earhart said how unassuming, how without mannerisms or feelings of superiority Anne Merle Lindbergh was, and said that she had physical and spiritual courage. Physical and spiritual courage. She had this special something. So, in my story, my journey from being a practicing planner to becoming a professor, I had questions. And so when I became a professor, I thought about the things that puzzled me as a planner, and that's what I decided to do research in. So here I am working for the City of Liberty, putting out our sign, letting people know there's a special use permit application we were processing. And so things I thought about was, why is that other professional saying that, particularly the city manager? How can I reach more citizens and give them a positive experience with their local government? What keeps planners going? Because you'll notice I am no longer in planning practice. It gets tough sometimes. Planners are really great, but don't have much voice. How can we have more impact? So, as a planner, I was thinking, how do we reach people and give them this meaningful experience? As a researcher, I started thinking about storytelling. And I leaned on Sandercock. Sandercock says that planning is performed story. She also says plans are stories communities tell about themselves. Well, I was reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about the importance of origin stories. And every community's plan has its roots in an origin story, and then it's a story that the community is hoping will be their story in the future. So, origin stories. So, on the campus of the University of Kansas is this fountain. It's the Chi Omega fountain. And it has a roundabout around it. Oh. So we had a roundabout a long time ago. Hello. But the Chi Omega fountain has engraved into it an origin story. It's, of course, from Greek mythology. So the story is of Persephone, daughter of Demeter, and Demeter is the goddess of the earth and harvest. So of course one day Hades, the god of the underworld, kidnaps Persephone to be his bride, and he takes her underground into his kingdom. Well, Demeter, her mother, was pretty upset about this, and so she just was so distraught, and she cursed the earth, causing a famine. And people started going, "Oh, Zeus, can you do something?" And Zeus was like, I can go talk to my brother Hades, but I don't know. So Zeus sent Hermes, the messenger, to retrieve Persephone. Hades was not real willing to give up his new bride. Hermes said, well, can she just be up on Earth part of the time and down here some other time? And so Hades was like, okay. And so, but he tricked Persephone. Apparently, if you eat anything in the underworld, you're stuck there. So remember that. So she had eaten a couple of seeds from a pomegranate. And so she had to stay there part of the year. But the rest of the year, she would come up on Earth, and Demeter would be happy, and you would have spring and the harvest, and life on Earth was great. And then Persephone would go back down, and then you would get winter time. So that's the origin story of how we get the seasons. So there's that origin story. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer tells about the creation story that many indigenous nations have as the creation story. And it's the story of Sky Woman who fell through a hole in the sky and headed for this big ocean that was down below. Now, Sky Woman, as she started to fall through the sky, grabbed a bit of the tree of life, and she was falling, and the animals saw this, and some snow geese came along, and they took her on their wings and helped her land safely on a giant turtle. And she was like, oh, thank you so much. And all these animals came to go, what is this creature that has fallen from the sky? And she was like, I have these seeds, but I don't have anything to plant them in. And so all the sea creatures were like, oh, we think that there's some mud down on the ocean floor, and if we can get that and bring this up, then you can plant your seeds and can grow things. And so all the animals tried, the sturgeon, the otters, the beavers, they all tried, and they couldn't do it. Well, along came the tiny muskrat. The tiny muskrat dove down and was gone for a really long time, and they thought maybe he died. But then they saw bubbles come up, and here comes the muskrat. He had in his paw some soil, some dirt, some mud. Sky Woman took that. She patted it on the shell of the giant turtle, and she danced on it and patted it with her feet and planted the seeds, and they started to grow. And thus we have Earth, and all the animals are our brothers and sisters and the plants. Now, the story of how we get seasons, the story of Sky Woman, which one, if you were a woman, would you want to be your origin story? Being kidnapped and taken down as hostage with Hades, and that's just your lot in life, baby. Or Sky Woman starts the whole earth. Origin stories make a difference. And in my history and theory of planning class, I have students go out to the Chi Omega fountain, and we reenact the Sky Woman story, and here they are blowing bubbles to signify the bubbles that came up when the muskrat was headed back up to the surface. Also in Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about just really short little stories, and this is just like a one-sentence short story, origin story of someone, a boy raised by a river. Now, just in that little bit, you know so much about that boy. So, my story, I was a girl raised by the Mother Road. The Mother Road, meaning Route 66, the highway that was built in the 1920s from Chicago, Illinois to Santa Monica, California. It goes through Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. I grew up in Oklahoma. My grandmother was Mrs. Route 66. She was born on Route 66. At one point, all 5 of her daughters lived along Route 66, and she knew that when she passed away, she would be buried in Devonport Cemetery on Route 66. Here you can see my dad's hobby, the heyday, the glamorous days of Route 66, when a car meant something. And then, when I got my first job out of planning school, it was in Amarillo, Texas, on Route 66, home of the Cadillac Ranch. I think this sometimes brought a tear to my dad's eye, his love of classic cars. But Route 66 went through downtowns, connecting through main streets. I grew up in Shawnee, Oklahoma, with a wonderful downtown. And the jingle, shop the center, shop Shawnee, hey. On one corner was a Sears department store. Right opposite on the other corner was JCPenney's department store. It had everything. You bought your uniform for summer softball at the sporting goods store downtown. You went with mom to the office supply store to get supplies for the office. There were shoes, clothes, toys, everything. Oh, right there downtown. Love a good downtown. My parents owned and operated for almost 50 years a monument shop in Shawnee, Oklahoma, right across from the cemetery, as any good monument shop should be located. And there's my mom and dad. My dad in his uniform for working in the back of the shop making the monuments. My mom in her little suit. She was front of house and bookkeeper. And so I grew up around monuments, little bits of things that help people remember. And they're made of granite. Those memories are made of granite. They're going to be there for a while. My father would also make not only monuments for individual people, he would make monuments that were war memorials or would depict the history of an area. These are the monuments he made for Pawhuska, Oklahoma. It shows the history of Pawhuska, of discovering oil, the Osage Nation. And you might have heard of Pawhuska as it is now home to the pioneer woman, Ree Drummond. But more importantly, it's the home base for the Osage Nation. And I really love that now, because of the popularity of Pawhuska, so many people can come and see my father's work. So, good storytelling has some fantasy and spectacle to it, but can we create ethical spectacles? What can catch people's attention? Can planners use television, perhaps, to reach people? Well, in Earth Day, April 22nd in 2009, the MPO for the Kansas City Metro region, the Mid-America Regional Council, did a televised town hall meeting. They helped people imagine what Kansas City could be like in the future. And the MPO and the Mid-America Regional Council covers multiple counties on both sides of the state line. So on that night, when they showed the show on the PBS station in Kansas City, they had a live studio audience, invited citizens to participate. They were at the studio, but they had 4 satellite locations at community colleges around the region. And so there were 4 satellite locations, and for this live television show where they showed little snippets of different things that were to get people to thinking about the future of Kansas City, they would check in with the live audiences participating in the community colleges. So imagine KC television show. It had a website where you could go and tell your opinion. They also had live operators standing by for you to be able to call in. And so they had animated bits. They talked about, the proliferation of garbage and how many times it would fill Arrowhead Stadium, things like that. In the end, we know from Nielsen ratings that 10,600 households watched Imagine KC. How many citizen participation things reached that many people? It was amazing. When it was re-aired on April 26th, 8,000 households watched. So how did this ethical spectacle work? Well, it hit upon all of the things that Duncombe said made for an ethical spectacle. One thing it did was it showed animation of a streetcar going through Kansas City. And remember, this is 2009. Now, today, in 2025, what is in downtown Kansas City? Real, live streetcars. And it's so successful, they're expanding it. So I was talking the other day about my research on staff reports and how like nobody reads them, they're just awful. But I realized I was talking to a communications professor, and she said, so what's wrong with rational communication? And this is the image that came to my mind. This was when I presented at the National Planning Conference, and I asked the planners in the room to text in one word that you think of when you hear staff report. And this is what they texted in. So in planning, we really have, despite different ways of doing things, different theories, have really stuck close to this rational model. And you can really see it in staff reports. But I thought, you know, what can we do? What can we do to get that, that in your brain, that way of like seeing the world differently? How can we create sparks with our staff reports? And staff reports are things that planners do day in and day out all over the world. They do them in other countries as well. But they respond to applications to rezone a property or to build the McDonald's in a certain place, or how to preserve a historic building, platting property, all of that. And the planner is using plans and policy to see, is this a good idea or not? And they're generally written from a very rational, neutral position. But I'm wondering, how can we maybe create some sparks? Get people to free their mind. So, finding the spark in staff reports. So, myself being a, what am I, Gen X? So, I know my TV. I grew up with the TV at a time when there were only 3 major stations, so thank you very much, and PBS. But I love reality TV, particularly shows that show these really creative people at work. I just love seeing them at work. And I thought, boy, could I do that? Could I be creative like that? Could staff reports and planners be creative like that? Well, the avant-garde art movement says, yes, you can. They take everyday objects and they've decided that just if you say, hey, that's art, it's art. It's also a way of, the avant-garde movement was about social criticism, a rejection of norms, and very much, you don't have to be declared an artist and housed within a gallery to be an artist. You can do this, you can be an artist. So I was like, whoa, okay. And then, of course, I really love Project Runway, Making the Cut. And in those shows, they often have a competition where the designer is to design clothing that's avant-garde. And it's usually very just wackadoo. You wouldn't really wear that down the street. Sometimes you can't even sit down on it, stuff like that. But the designers use that to inspire ready-to-wear, things that you wear every day. And so in Making the Cut, this was the avant-garde look. And then they turned it to an accessible look, that's something that could be easily manufactured, could be bought off the rack. So that got me thinking, boy, could we do avant-garde staff reports that make you think differently about ready-to-wear staff reports? So I started with a style board, which is like a mood board, but you just collect different types of the same thing. It could be teapots, and this would be all sorts of different kinds of teapots. So I collected all sorts of different staff reports so they could just see what's out there. And I placed it within the framework of fashion thinking, where they look to the past, they look to the future, they look to elites, they look to streetwear. What are people wearing on the street? And then I looked to create a mood board. And this is actually a mood board that a student created about staff reports that he was hoping would be in the future. So I thought, let's get some more inspiration. So I went to the University of Kansas's Spencer Museum of Art and looked for inspiration. Well, this is out front of the Spencer Museum of Art, and it's 5 different signs like this by an artist, Edgar Heap of Birds. And he's helping us to see things differently. This is Kansas, but it's not Kansas. And who you think is your host may not be who you think is your host. Your host is Kickapoo. Your host are these indigenous nations that were here. And so he reverses the name of Kansas, all trying to get you to think differently, to rewire your brain as to what's maybe happening underneath. So this is another piece of art, Around the Cake by Wayne Thibault. And on the right is an avant-garde staff report that a student made in my class. And it has different bits and pieces of the staff report, and if you look under the icing to see the little details that are in there, it's like, think about this differently. And so I have students do avant-garde staff reports, and you'll see one where they made, which I think this is brilliant. The staff report was the Kerplunk game, where you pull out the different pieces and maybe then the beads fall through. Others made one that was a shopping bag, and then an origami staff report, kind of showing how it's like this, but then there's really all this going on in the background. So that then gave me the idea, let's see what planning commissioners think of staff reports. I'm gonna show them some avant-garde staff reports in this, see what they think. Okay, here I go. So I created a staff report that was a mobile, and we all the time talk about that planning is about balancing. Well, here I took an actual case from the city of Lawrence, Kansas, and I had to literally make it balance, which is harder than you think. And then I also did kind of a bells and whistle newsletter. But so I showed these to planning commissioners, and it was interesting. They sometimes said things like, well, I think this helped you. Not sure it helped us. And they kind of were like, the staff report, it is what it is. You can't really do too much with it. This using this art thing, no, because, the public needs to know we're serious. But the planning commissioners wanted to know what happened behind the scenes. What was the thought process? How did the application change from beginning to end? They saw planning, and what the planners did is this black box that they couldn't peek into. And so they really hungered for, well, what went on? They weren't real. I did some different ways of getting a staff report out there. It could be an ebook or a podcast or a video, and they were like, we're not sure that we like any of those things. We just want it on paper. Or just give us a written report. But the big thing that I discovered was that as I was facilitating these conversations with these planning commissioners and their staffs, the commissioners would ask questions like, hey, why are our meetings scheduled the way they are? Why is it that we do the public hearing this way? Why don't we have a staff recommendation? And it started this conversation, things that the planning staff thought the commissioners knew, but they didn't. So what I actually stumbled upon was that planning commissioners and their staffs need to stop and talk every now and then about what's going on, what's working, what's not. We're on this team together. But if they never stop and talk about things, they're never going to know. Also, there were instances where the Planning Commission were like, we love the planners' reports. Police department, not so much. So it was that they needed to talk to each other. And that was kind of what I discovered. So, my next question, why is that other professional saying that? Well, I thought, well, let's compare professions. So you know, this is an image of Chicago in the 1800s. I mean, when cities were, everybody was moving from the countryside into cities in the late 1800s, cities became like these overcrowded, actually pretty awful places to live, but also pretty darn exciting. But they were unsafe, congested, unhealthy, corrupt, and 5 professions started to jump in. And those professions were city managers, city planning, engineers, architects, landscape architects, social workers. All of them had in common that they were going to be these professions that were going to help cities be better places to live. Now, what is a profession? Full-time work, training, some licensing or certification, but a code of ethics. So I started looking at the codes of ethics of these different professions, particularly city managers and planners, because it was the city managers that puzzled me the most. So here's the 5 professions and their professional organizations and when they were founded. The City Managers Association in 1914 and the American Institute of Planners in 1917. So this is a clip from the show Cheers, and if you're not familiar with Cheers, the fellow on the right is the postman, Cliff Clavin, and he's a bit of a know-it-all. And then on the left is Fraser Crane, the psychiatrist. And so in this clip, think of me as Fraser Crane.
Yeah, it's a genetic quirk in the Clavin family that we all have 2 extra teeth. You see, that's the only way that we can prove that we are the rightful heirs to the Russian throne.
Hello in there, Cliff. Tell me, what color is the sky in your world?
So I was often wondering, city manager, what is the color of the sky in your world? Because I don't understand why you're doing what you're doing. So I looked at their codes of ethics of the International City County Management Association and compared it to the American Institute of Certified Planners. And what I really found was that those city managers are really looking out for the dignity and the worth of government. Planners, not so much. We're much more willing to kind of be the advocates and to certainly pay a lot more attention to the grassroots and to what citizens are saying. Whereas the city managers are interested in the elected officials and they really cannot be involved in politics. Whereas planners can be much more involved politically. And so what I was responding to was a city manager being much more attentive to elected officials. And I was going, oh no, let's reach the citizens, come on. And they were like, the mayor said this, why are you wanting to do anything else? So it did help me understand their world more. And understanding our profession's baggage, their profession's baggage, so that we can look out for each other. There are things that planners are blind to, but there's things that we see. There are things that city managers are blind to, but that they see. If we work together, we can maybe look out for our blind spots. So, the next thing, planners are really great, but don't have much voice. How can we have more impact? And that made me think of leadership. Now, in terms of leadership, sometimes people think that civil servants or planners are like, if they're the leaders, it's like letting the raccoon into the hen house. There's, oh, we elected officials are supposed to do everything. If we let you in, you're just gonna run all over the place and destroy everything. It's like, well, okay. And that's our tendency to be neutral, to stay in the background. But you also, as a planner, sometimes feel like actually you're the chickens in the hen house and the fox is outside. And so what can you do to maybe not be the raccoon and then maybe sometimes not be the chicken that everybody's looking at and you're shaking in your boots? And then this is the picture on the far side is me as a young planner, and that's the chair of our planning commission, Larry Wepler from the City of Liberty. And you can see me going, please Larry, say what I told you to say. Please, don't go off the cuff. And so I've like, my only leadership is I've tried to get Larry to do the right thing, but I'm not the one standing up there. So are there ways that planners can be leaders? I was interested in that. And so I started looking at theories of leadership. The literature on leadership has finally broken away from this idea of like the great man on the pedestal as the leader, that only leaders are born. No, there's all sorts of different ways of being a leader, and you can learn how to do it. So I went looking around. I also looked at theories of planning to see, is there any places where those theories of leadership and planning intersect? And of course, I turned to codes of ethics. I looked at the codes of ethics of professional planning organizations from these different countries, and then also the European Council of Spatial Planners, to see if I could find where they talk about leadership. Well, I did find that quite a few of the different types of leadership were ones that planners did find comfortable to do. There were some that were uncomfortable for them. And things like transactional leadership, where it's, you do this and I'll give you a raise. Yeah, that's planners, generally that's not going to be what we can do. Directive leadership, you're going to do this. Yeah, planners, not so much. But I was surprised that shared or team leadership was not something that I could find in theory or in the codes of ethics. But we do know that as planners, we have to work with other people to really find power. And then that charismatic leadership, yeah, that's that kind of that great leader on the podium. Maybe that's not all planners. But there are things you can do. What keeps planners going? Motivation. In public administration, there's a measure actually for public service motivation. You do a survey and it scores to see how public service minded you are. And so I gave that to planners. And what I found was, as you put this into a regression and everything, the general model of public service motivation, if you were female, you had more of it, woot woot. If you were a current planner, you know, the one working the front desk, that was negatively related, historic preservation, negative, But if you were in an entrepreneurial organization, motivation went up. There's a subscale of public service motivation of attraction to policymaking. Again, female, long-range planners, makes sense, positive. Transportation, economic development, urban design, all wanting to do that policymaking. Entrepreneurial organization, woo! But if your organization was very close-knit and family-oriented, not so much. Maybe like that you don't want to upset the apple cart. And if the public does do government bashing, hey, hello, that reduces your motivation. You know, we kind of, that's been going around. And then the subscale about civic duty, again, our poor current planners, historic preservation, but if you wanted to play the technical role or the facilitator role, your civic duty feelings went up. Some more motivation. I started paying attention to the work of Octavia Butler after reading Parable of the Sower. She wrote Kindred, Parable of the Sower. And as I read Parable of the Sower, I went, man, how did she do it? She saw the future. She wrote Parable of the Sower in the 1980s and set it in the United States of 2024. The world she made up was of walled neighborhoods, corporate-owned cities, a climate with little rain, hyper-empathetic individuals bearing the brunt of the feelings of others' pain, regular space travel, failed governments, drug abuse that burns everything to the ground, and guns. How did she know? How did she do it? I was like, I've got to find out. And she said of science fiction that it's a handful of earth and a handful of sky and everything around and between. Sounds like planning to me. And boy, she was a planner. I read this book, A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, by Linnell George, and tried to figure out what was her life like. And so George writes about how did Butler build her life as a writer. And Butler left a ton of clues. She left all this ephemera, notes and notebooks and diaries, boxes of typewriter ribbon, and everything, make people touch and taste and know, make people feel. These were her things that she wrote to herself that kept her going. She wrote, no entertainment on earth can match a good story compellingly told. And I would say the best planning on earth is a good story compellingly told. George talks about the tools that Octavia Butler used: a notebook, a diary, a library card, a bus pass. She got around San Francisco and Sacramento all by bus, and she used it as an office. She would work on the bus. A calendar, a set of contracts with yourself, some advisors, the news. She was a news junkie. And she knew if the news was frustrating, she'd use it to fuel her writing. And then having a sense of place, real, imagined, and literary. So in George's book, here is Butler's approach. How does one establish a dream? You have a plan. You figure out what you have and what you need. Planners do this all the time. Needs assessments, SWOT analyses. Our stories are fiction, our promises are not. Where may I find a fear killer? A human notebook, being an observer. A second home, that was the bus for her. Keep your own counsel. It can be the door to the multiverse. History is another planet. The past is another planet. There's nothing more uncertain than the future. But we can create futurescapes and keepsakes that drive us forward. So free your mind and free our profession. I was looking at advertisements for jobs. So on one side is a planner for a consulting firm where they say they're seeking someone desiring to incorporate creativity, storytelling, artistry, and outstanding energy in their public design and planning pursuits. Woo woo! It's a job I want. And then was an opening for a planner for a city. We foster a fun and supportive environment. We encourage creativity and individual initiative. Wow, this is so cool. Maybe those current planners, there's hope for them yet. So avant-garde staff reports. What is this thing that could make staff reports better? It's similar to Christopher Alexander's The Quality Without a Name. Get to the spark, get to life. Sandercock says that planners' reports are cut from the same cliched cloth, and that the reports suck the life out of things. How can we get to life? Well, all right, free your mind. Free your mind and your ass will follow. Okay, Arlene, bring it on home. What is that certain something? Well, Arlene Francis, or rather Arlene Francis Kazajan Gable. The Gable she got through marriage to Martin Gable, and the Kazajan was from her father, from Armenia. She dropped her family name when she became an actress because everyone would pronounce it as Katzenjammer, which was a popular comic strip at the time. Her father immigrated to the U.S. from Armenia. He was studying art in France when he learned both of his parents were dead in one of the massacres perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire. She was on Broadway in many plays and was on all 3 TV networks at the same time, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And she was a long time, 25 years, panelist on the game show What's My Line? And that's the picture on the far side. There's Arlene, and the point of the game was someone would show up, and it was essentially 20 questions. The panel of celebrities would ask questions to figure out what the person's profession was. And so, of course, there would be the lovely, captivating woman that actually was a rocket scientist. Oh, my. And they would ask questions to figure out, what, could she be a rocket scientist? What? But for these panel game shows, they dressed up in evening wear. And so there's Arlene, and in the middle is celebrity Bennett Cerf, publisher at Random House, a celebrity. He also wrote books with puns. And then Dorothy Kilgallen, columnist and journalist. And then the host of the show was John Daly, who reported from the front lines in World War II. He was the first reporter to report about Pearl Harbor. He's hosting the game show. But they took charm seriously. And Arlene is the expert. She wrote the book, That Certain Something, The Magic of Charm, by Arlene Francis. And for Arlene, charm is about being your best self. It's not about being fake. She does write in her book an awful lot about being well-groomed. That's part of it. But it's about being yourself. And so here's the chapters of That Certain Something. And she has some bits of wisdom for becoming charming. She talks about in chapter 2 that indifference and boredom cannot survive in an atmosphere of lively communication. Lively communication arises from the capacity to listen intelligently and to help draw people out of themselves. In doing so, you begin to immerse yourself, thereby removing another barrier on the way to natural and unaffected charm. Chapter 7, a genuine interest in others is the best self-interest we can generate. It's hard to conceive that you can be interested in others and still maintain any sort of prejudice. So she has lots of advice. One thing that I think is, and I have my book, That Certain Something, that I think is good advice for planners and the planning profession. She talks about being a good host. I think being a good host is also about being a good democracy, about being a good public servant, about being civic. So she says, no guest should ever arrive at a party without the hostess to greet them at the door. Yet this happens time after time. No guest should have to wander around a room trying to break into the small verbal circles that seem to form without the direct intervention of the hostess. No guest should ever be left with such a group without the hostess opening up the mutual interests of the new guest and the conversing group with a wedge and standing by until the guest is comfortable and at home. No hostess should be so badly organized, see planning, that she has to disappear from the party at frequent intervals and forget her major duties, that of keeping a party going. If she has to do this, she is badly organized. And if she can't be organized, she just can't be a den mother, that's all. Being a good host or hostess takes a bit of doing, but it must be tackled with a gaiety of spirit, not the grudging, how did I get myself into this mess attitude. Just think of the pleasure you're going to have when you finally take your shoes off and the party's over, my friend. So I think planners should be hosts, good hosts, and I think it will improve democracy and improve our profession. So, one more story or crumb, and then I'm done. Look, it's a yellow cardinal. That make your brain go, oh! So telling your fish. So my husband tells this story of his father was a social worker, and he had to appear as a witness in family court. He was in the courtroom during small claims court, and there was somebody there, a gentleman with a very badly taxidermied fish. And he had taken the company that did the taxidermied fish to court to get his money back. And so he was there with his fish. The judge took one look at the fish, did his gavel, and said, $1,000. There you go, sir, because it was so obviously bad. But the man kept going, well, but this was my fish, and I caught it at this lake, and it gave me a hard time, but then I got it in the boat, and the judge was like, no, you won. You got your $1,000. Move on. Well, but I was fishing, and this happened, and I got this fish, and I took it, and so the man just wanted to tell his fish. So in my husband's family, they would talk about, I want to tell my fish, and you've got to listen. So thank you for letting me tell my fish. Let others tell their fish. But remember, tell your fish too. It's the only way you're going to become charming. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for coming. This is really interesting. I especially really like that first question you went over, like how to reach people, and like I think your talk really kind of, for me, connected to how like planners relate to modes of communication. And I related, as you were talking, I was thinking in my head about comparing it to how politics, for example, politicians are always trying to use different methods of communication to reach constituents, win re-election. And I think we saw that, really potently in the last elections, like TikTok. And then you talk about the thing that you do through, class about avant-garde staff reports. I thought that was really interesting, and it kind of relates, I think, to a lot of projects architecture students do. And so I was just curious, running that experiment, researching this, how do you recommend planners think about more effective modes of communication to reach more people without letting the medium of communication itself dictate the outcomes that planners think about and are supposed to enact?
Well, and that's where I think trying to think about how we're communicating from a place of authenticity, kind of dropping away the rational model and that we've got to be so value neutral. And I think when you're bringing that authentic self to the party, that's what's going to make communication make sense to people. When they know, yes, you're a planner, but you're a human, and you have doubts and you have weaknesses and strengths, and being able to talk with everybody. I think being able to draw out those stories from other people, and so whatever medium you're using, and really it's about using everything at your disposal. It's so much easier now to communicate, but it's also so much easier now to be overwhelmed. And some advice from Arlene. She talks about in your journey to becoming charming that you need interests and deep interests, or you're not going to be interesting to other people. And she says, don't just run off in all directions. Find one book, get into that, then look at, oh, who wrote that? And then think about, oh, well, what else did they write? And you become deeply immersed in something. And that's where I think planners, in using whatever communication tool they use, whether it's a staff report or a podcast, it's that focus. It's the, dare I say, abandoning the web thinking. I mean, you can think it, but then realize I'm not going to dump this citizen into the middle of a web. I'm going to tell them these interesting, deep things that I've learned, and hopefully it will spark something in them. So use whatever you can, but just remember that that person is being bombarded, and you've got to make it this something that's going to spark their brain, or it's not going to mean anything to them. So does that kind of answer your question? Oh, yeah.
Thank you for your talk as well. You talked about Imagine KC and how they had run that portfolio and how successful it was. Do you know of any other places in the U.S. or without that have done something similar or have tried to update that model? Because, you know, that like even in 2009, I feel like that model was going away. Now we have things like live streams on the internet, things of that nature. Do people like have they actually incorporate that same kind of framework with the new tools that we have?
I haven't really continued on this specific line of research, so I don't know what is out there currently. What was interesting was doing this back in 2009. There were so few things like this because technologically it just was difficult to do. But in the New York region in the 70s, they did a series of documentaries on PBS, and they gave out books, paperbacks, that was like, imagine the New York City region. And then they had where people would fill out a survey that was in the newspaper and mail it in. And then they had, so they were trying to do this with what they had. And now it's so much easier to do that sort of thing that I can imagine there's all sorts of things out there like that. But again, it's the using that to your best ability and reaching people. And after that first Imagine KC show, they did a series of it. And so that PBS station did more. So I don't know what all is out there now, but I just know that when I was fully researching it, it was very difficult to find examples. In Honolulu, they did this on their local TV station, again, like in the, well, maybe in the 1980s, but they did issues of the day, but did them like Saturday Night Live skits. And I've never been able to get a hold of it. I was like, what did they do? What was that like? And so it was rare, but now it's like doing it well, I'm sure, is the challenge. And what I did find out from the research, so they showed the website during the show, and you could go there and do a survey. You could also call and talk to the operators standing by, and they would do a survey. So now you know 10,000 households. How many surveys do you think I got from people watching the show? Can you guess how many numbers? 1,000? Any other guesses? 75. I do wonder if today it would be better, because people today are probably have their phone in their hand while they're watching TV and could do the survey. But I then did some research with a media professor who was like, people don't switch back and forth between mediums like that. And so I was asking people to watch the show and do a survey, and that apparently was a bad idea. But I do wonder if now we would get more of a response.
Bonnie, I wonder if I could
Yeah.
ask a question as we close, which is, I'm wondering about, I mean, this is wonderful research, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us, and it's making me think about maybe when stories go wrong, and whether a research area that you've thought about, and I'm thinking in particular about the 15-minute city narrative. It's such a rich story, but it's gone kind of pear-shaped in its application. I wonder if you've thought about that. So it's the stories that go well, right, and people, and then there's the stories that seem like they did quite. It's a great story, but it didn't quite get to where we kind of hoped it.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I think stories are so important in planning, because we're always having to adjust. I mean, in political science, we learn that any sort of social science where you're studying humans, anytime you discover something and you let them know, they'll change. Oh, darn it. We finally in political science have a theory that works, and now it doesn't because they now do something different. It's the same with stories. You know, back in the 90s, we had this thing, and planners thought, oh, we've conquered the problem of how to control growth and get people to not just sprawl everywhere. We'll call it smart growth. Smart growth. And then it was taken over by, people want us to do smart growth, and that's the United Nations wanting to herd us into cities. So, we can't call it smart growth anymore. Sustainability. Oh, let's try sustainability. Everybody would love to be sustainable, right? You can't. Well, apparently that darn United Nations ruined sustainability for us too, because they keep wanting to do things to us. And then it was resilience. We're going to be resilient. Now it's the 15-minute city. So planners actually have to keep changing the story because it will get hijacked. And so you've got to be ready with the next story, or you're just going to, that darn United Nations, where it's just they'll just ruin it for you. Boy.
Well, thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.